Hi, my name's Tori Bush. I'm a PhD candidate at LSU. I'm here to share with you a work in progress called Eco-orientalism, Island as Laboratory of Climate Migration. This is a shorter version of a longer essay that I'm working on, and would love to discuss it further with whoever. I'm going to share my screen now. So I'm coming to you from New Orleans, um, also known as Bobancha, the land of many languages, home of the Chata, Chirimacha, Arakapa Ishak, Choctaw, Tunica, Biloxi, Washa, and many other peoples. So I want to start where many others have begun, with the road. Island Road to Ile de Jean Charles is not exactly a road, but more like a levee now. The earth dug out from somewhere else and built up against the water in a vain attempt to provide easy access to the oil and gas industry pipelines crisscrossing the area. Built in the mid-20th century when oil expansion was booming throughout the coast of Louisiana and Texas, the road provided infrastructure to put in new pipelines, but was also a bridge between Ile de Jean Charles and the Kiligan-shaped coastline. The road is a good metaphor, perhaps too good, for the spatial and discursive distance of the island from the central powers of the United States, as well as the line of separation between the precarity of the island and the anxiety of white Western audiences about the future of climate change. A long paved strip of road surrounded by water on each side has proved to be a visual metaphor that photographers, journalists, and filmmakers have been unable to resist. The Ile de Jean Charles section in Elizabeth Colbert's recent book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, published in 2021, begins, "The island can be reached by a single, narrow causeway, which used to ride over land. Time it right, and you can now fish from your car." In her Pulitzer nominated book, Rising, Dispatches from the New American Shore, published in 2018, Elizabeth Rush opens a chapter by writing, "Sometime during my first week in the Louisiana Bayou, I walked to Ile de Jean Charles. The island road, built in the early 50s, runs 8 miles southwest of Point au Chien, out between two expanses of water so new that neither has a name." And in the first article from the New York Times, which reported on the federal grant to relocate the community island, Coral Davenport and Robert Campbell write, "Each morning at 3:30, when Joanna Berg leaves the mildewed and rusted house that her parents built on her grandfather's property, she worries that the bridge connecting this bit of waterlogged land to Louisiana's terra firma will again be flooded and she will miss another day's work." Why do each of these texts begin their discussion of the small island with the road? The road, like other rhetorical tropes, becomes a repeated literary element which opens these texts and connects the audience to this specific place, an island far from, yet connected to the mainland. The road also acts as a narrative marker of identity, suggesting the island community is separated culturally, racially, and historically from the nation, paving the way for a comparison between the indigeneity of the island to the nation, ultimately destabilizing the community's land claims. By pointing out how representations such as Island Road are incomplete visions or tropes repeated so many times that they lose their meaning, I hope to point to the way that the discursive practices of science writing about Ile de Jean Charles are hyper-real, yet deeply impacting the material agency and ecologies of this place. This essay utilizes Edward Said's concept of Orientalism to analyze the construction of power through author positionality, rhetoric, and use of tropes. Said's work brings into focus an important question: whom creates, maintains, and manages the representation of a place, its people, and culture? I posit that with the rise of narrative representations of climate change, environmentalists from the global north are eco-orientalizing peripheral spaces as a method of material and discursive control over the impending changes to our spatial relationship with the planet. In this essay, I argue that eco-orientalism, a term I develop here that builds on Edward Said's Orientalism and eco-critical scholar David Mazel's idea that the American literary environmentalism be approached as a form of what he called domestic Orientalism, or a discourse based on knowledge, which is organized hegemonically by contemporary Western politics, capital, and power. I define eco-orientalism as a discourse developed through environmental writing and writers, which separates or disconnects people and places vulnerable to global warming and rising seas. This discourse, like Orientalism, has profound material impacts on place. However, it posits that the global North's tradition of environmentalism as a source of power in which peripheral places are constructed and made vulnerable. I try to expand this concept to call attention to the way that peripheral spaces, such as Ile-de-Jean-Charles, have become hyper-constructed in terms of climate change to achieve three things: to control and administer the preliminary experiments of climate migration on the US coastline, to relieve climate anxiety for those within the nation by portraying these spaces as separate and far from the center, and three, to control both the community and environment by dominating, restructuring, and having authority over these territories and lives that the environment will displace. I will explore these after effects of eco-orientalism through reading contemporary science writers who've constructed Ile-de-Jean-Charles as a laboratory space and testing ground for rising seas and coming climate migration on the new American shore. Edward Said's classic text, Orientalism, argues that the Orient is a European construct that both creates and maintains control of political, intellectual, social, moral, and cultural power. While Said's Orientalism informs the basis of my argument, Ile-de-Jean-Charles is one very small island rather than half of an entire world. Eco-orientalism, in my mind, is not limited to Ile-de-Jean-Charles, but to any environment which has been hyper-constructed as existing on the forefront of the impacts of climate change. It also suggests that eco-orientalizing discourse is multifaceted in both space and time. There are manifold peripheries where there is an intention to produce, control, and maintain that space, despite or perhaps because of the ongoing material loss of place as the oceans rise and the lands subside. As the American frontier was also hyper-constructed space, so is this new sort of reverse frontier in which the national boundaries disappear into the water, highlighting the material precarity of national borders themselves. This conceptualization of eco-orientalism falls in line with other scholars who have applied Orientalism as a concept to places outside of the Middle East and Asia, but provides a lens for critiquing the discourses surrounding global warming and climate change, as notably power and resources shift with planetary reckoning. Another significant difference between Said's Orientalism and Eco-orientalism is Said's archive of texts was incredibly vast. And while there are many articles in some books about how climate change impacts Ile-de-Jean-Charles, it is just a glimmer in comparison. If, as Said says, at some very basic level, imperialism means thinking about, settling on, and controlling land that you do not possess, that is distant, that is lived on and owned by others, how will national empires such as the United States try to control and maintain the edges of these shores as they sink below the ocean waters? Eco-orientalist discourses illuminate the Western anxiety and mourning of land loss, but also how nostalgia can harden the ideological boundaries of nationalism while material places sink below the waves. The selection of texts I analyze are made up of science writing about Ile-de-Jean-Charles, a surprisingly large archive, however, for such a small island. Journalists and writers from the New Yorker to Teen Vogue have written about the island, and in the longer version of this essay, I also discuss two other books, Elizabeth Rush's Rising and Elizabeth Colbert's Under a White Sky. In this abridged essay, I read Coral Davenport and Campbell Robertson's coverage of the New York Times as a literary text, investigating the themes, the narrative structure, and genre tropes found within. As Stacey Alamo wrote in Exposed, Environmental Politics and Pleasure in Posthuman Times, popular science writing, whether it appears in books, magazines, websites, or social media, is one of the most crucial genres for environmentalism, yet it remains relatively neglected within the environmental humanities. Why is it so important to note how science writers, journalists, and policymakers are framing the discourse around migration for this community? The dominant global narrative and rhetoric of climate change are quickly being changed and formed, while conceptualization of humankind's impact on the planet's climate can be traced back to the early colonial era. It's only in the last 20 years that contemporary language of climate change has been widely used and applied throughout the world. As Dipesh Chakrabarty pointed out, who is the we when we talk about the impacts of the human on the planet? Why should one include those whose carbon footprint is relatively small? Science writing has come to define how climate change, global warming, and its effects are discussed in the United States. While science writing such as this New York Times article is essential for sharing the news of how planetary changes are evolving, it still remains a discourse of power, a discourse which inherits the problems of the US environmental movement over the last century, one in which sources of institutional power has been exceedingly white, middle class, and straight perspectives. I explore the genre of popular science writing through texts that have focused on Ile de Jean-Charles, and within these texts, Ile de Jean-Charles is rhetorically constructed as both an ominous warning for a possible future for the coastal United States, but also a space that is a world unto itself, far from the centers of power, and thus safely away from many readers' own geographical positions. Eco-orientalism, a contemporary discourse, clarifies how these rhetorical tropes, such as the use of the term refugee and the representation of the island as separate from the nation, maintain colonial strategies for controlling land and people, signaling an epistemological construction rather than a grounded material one. So in May of 2016, the New York Times reported an article titled "Resettling the First American Climate Refugees," which reported on a federal grant of $48 million to relocate Ile de Jean-Charles community due to sea rise from climate change. And I've included here a small map which sort of locates Ile de Jean-Charles on the coast of Louisiana. The island community was dubbed the First American Climate Refugees, a term which reveals critical questions about power, authority, and who is considered a part of the American nation. Coral Davenport, who has covered energy and environmental policy with a focus on climate change since 2013, along with Campbell Robertson, who is a regional reporter for New Orleans, co-wrote this article. This text was the first to announce the first massive federal funding effort to relocate a community away from the coastline, along with another community in Alaska. And it ushered in an avalanche of news reports on the islands. This article in many ways set the tone and themes written about in other articles and texts, which duplicated much of the rhetoric found here. The title of the article itself offers a number of rhetorical moves which takes agency and power away from the community it describes. The first, where the title, resettling, is a gerund, which modifies the noun of climate refugees. It acts as a verb without a subject, thus leaving it unclear who is doing or enforcing the resettling, while who is being resettled, or the object of the title, is receiving the action of the unknown resettler. What is clear is that climate refugees are the passive objects in this grammatical construction. By looking closer at the rhetorical moves and themes throughout this article, the residents of Ile de Jean-Charles continue to be depicted as a passive other, contained and defined by these linguistic tropes. The rhetoric of the term refugee highlights the historical context of Ile de Jean-Charles, which is integral to any investigation on climate migration and its impacts on the islands. Ile de Jean-Charles has historically been a site of indigenous resistance to American white settler strategies of claiming and exploiting lands. With the arrival of European colonists and then US white settler colonialism, many tribes throughout the Gulf South were pushed to the peripheries of the country in order to escape US treaties, which were most often made to relocate tribes from their native lands. On May 28, 1830, the United States Senate passed the Indian Removal Act, driving American Indians, including the Muskogean-speaking tribes of the Gulf Coast, to be forcibly relocated or to designated reservations. However, tribal members persisted in living in the Gulf South by moving to land unoccupied by white settlers, such as coastal marshes and bayous like Ile de Jean-Charles. Surviving in peripheral places such as Ile de Jean-Charles was an act of ontological resistance. To exist outside of the reservations carved up by the US government and to build community on the periphery was a way to maintain tribal ways of being. The island has been home to the Ile de Jean-Charles band of Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw tribe, as well as members of the United Homa Nation for generations now. referring to the community of Ile-de-Jean-Charles as climate refugees highlights both the historical forced migration which led to the settling of the island by the tribe, but also how the term refugee is used to define who is part of a nation and who is not. By using the term refugee to describe the migration of a largely indigenous space to the mainland suggests this community is other and not a part of the nation, is a discourse that makes an already perilous place more vulnerable. In Robertson and Davenport's article, the journalists interview policymakers and experts who continuously deploy the rhetoric of climate refugee. The changes are underway and they are very rapid, Interior Secretary Sally Jewell warned last week. We will have climate refugees. They also interview Walter Kalin, the head of the Nansen Initiative, a research organization working with the United Nations to address extreme weather displacement. Quote, "You don't want to wait until people have lost their homes, until they flee and become refugees," he said. Both of these experts are actively participating in a renegotiation of who and what is considered a climate refugee. Because of these experts' subject locations, Sally Jewell as Secretary of the Interior under President Obama at that time, and Walter Kalin as a representative of the Nansen Initiative, which is now called the Platform on Disaster Development, they have the political, cultural, and intellectual authority to sway a discourse. These statements support the journalist's title and main statement that this community will be refugees without including any information that might complicate this designation. While I'm not arguing that Jewell and Kalin are intentionally trying to exclude the community from US sovereignty and protection, the rhetoric they choose to use implicitly positions the community outside of the protection their citizenship should afford them. This is what I would call an effective eco-orientalism, the unconscious assumption of power over those whose lives and lands are threatened. The New York Times article points to the way that the concept of the people of Ile-de-Jean-Charles are doubled and contradictory. Homi Bhabha writes of the post-colonial class as subaltern class as migrant workers, minorities, asylum seekers, and refugees who represent emergent, undocumented life worlds that break through the formal language of protection and status because they are neither insiders or outsiders, or for many of us, insiders officially considered outsiders. By dubbing this American community as refugees, their status as climate migrants make them sovereign insiders who are considered culturally, economically, and territorial outsiders to the nation. Ile-de-Jean-Charles is both liminal in terms of its sovereignty and the interstitial temporality as it transitions from above ground and below the Gulf. There is a colonial history of islands being used as laboratory sites for an empire. Richard Grove writes in Green Imperialism that the island easily became, in practical, environmental, as well as mental terms, an easily conceived allegory for the whole world. Contemporary observations of the ecological demise of the islands were easily converted into premonitions of environmental destruction on a more global scale. Ile-de-Jean-Charles is also constructed in this article as a sort of climate migration laboratory. Quote, "We see this as setting a precedent for the rest of the country, the rest of the world," said Marion McFadden, who's running the program at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. End quote. McFadden's precedent, however, allows the failures and mistakes which happened during an initial test to fall onto the living community of the island. Further, the economics of moving a community inland take precedent over the rights and relationships. The journalists quote another government employee. "That's one of the things we need to learn from the creation of this model is how to do it economically," said Pat Forbes, the executive director of the Louisiana State's Office of Community Development. End quote. While both state and federal employees see the island as a precedent or model in which they can test the economic impact of climate migration, there is surprisingly little inclusion of how residents want to relocate themselves. Anthropologists Carol Farbotko and Heather Lazarus write, "Climate is changing, but its meanings are contingent on place and history and cannot be imposed from above without risk of disjunctures and injustices. Captured wading through floods in photojournalism and documentaries, those identified as imminent climate refugees thus become symbols of a particular Western crisis of nature, a crisis that does not necessarily graft cleanly onto Tuvalu's own view of nature. Although these authors focus on the island nation of Tuvalu, their analysis also cleanly applies to the discourse of Ile de Jean Charles, framed by Davenport and Campbell. This photo that I've included here is from the New York Times article in which Amaya Brunette, a 3-year-old who lives on the island with her parents, sits on the fishing dock outside their house. A black and white cat stands behind her. While Amaya is not wading through the water, she is surrounded by it on all sides. A small white house with windows partially boarded up stands behind her. The caption to the photo states, Amaya Brunette 3, on the bridge that leads to her home, which fills up to a foot of mud during storms. Her parents, Keith Brunet and Keisha McGee, would like to leave the island. The photo highlights a certain romanticized solitude, the young girl alone on the island in need of assistance to move inland. Images like this threaten to make Amaya and her family romanticize symbols of climate change rather than a community trying to keep their family safe. Eco-orientalism is a power discourse which will only continue to amplify inequalities as seas rise and coastlines shrink. It is a concept that can help deconstruct these power dynamics and encourage science writers and their readers to consider those inherited dynamics. For Ile de Jean Charles, these power dynamics were part of the reason that the community did not accept the $48 million grant initially offered in 2016. They declined it in 2018. Chief Albert Nakin cited that the state dominated and began to control the resettlement project, which was supposed to be led by the community itself. Ile de Jean Charles would not trade their own agency, environment, and experience for that $48 million, a significant sum of money to return, because the state eco-orientalized the island community by controlling the process and administering the terms in which the community could access the grant. The process fell apart. Perhaps as science writers, policymakers, scholars, and those with the power to take note of eco-orientalism practiced within their own rhetoric, policies, and epistemologies, future communities will not have to undergo such uneven exchanges of discourse and power. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your comments.